In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the spark plugs on this Chevy Equinox. For this job, we will have to remove the intake manifold because two of the rear ones are hiding underneath it. So I also recommend having new gaskets on hand for your intake. Let's get started. Let's remove the engine cover. To do that, we're going to have to remove the oil filler cap and a little bolt right here. Start with the bolt. It's a T30 Torx bolt right down here. If there's a lot of debris around the filler cap, blow it off or clean it with a rag or something. That way when you remove this, it doesn't fall into the engine. And then pull up. It should pop off of a couple different rubber grommets that it's secured on. Set it aside. And it looks like we have some cleanup to do, but I will put the oil filler cap right back on. That way no debris can get inside the engine at this point. I need to remove this intake ducting here. There's a few things to disconnect, starting with this breather tube right here. To get this off, there's a clip or a tab that you have to pry up and out of its little locking area there, and then move the line out of the way and set it aside. Next, we have to unplug the throttle body, pull back on that locking tab, press on the tab for the connector, and pull it off of the throttle body motor. There it is, set the wiring aside. Underneath it, you'll see an 8mm headed clamp. We're gonna have to loosen this up just a little bit. On the air filter housing, there's another one, just like the first clamp. Loosen this up as well. This should allow you to pull the intake snorkel out of the way. Set that aside. This line that goes across the top of the intake is actually a coolant line. Now I'm not going to drain the coolant for this. Because it has a hose on each side, what I'm going to do is pinch off the hose and then we can pull the line aside and work that way. If you have hose crimping pliers, those would be ideal because they don't damage the hose, but they squeeze it nice and tight so no coolant can flow through. You can also use something like this that threads on and crimps the hose. Or if you really have to, you can use some locking pliers, just make sure you're gentle. Now we can loosen up the two clamps. I'm going to try and twist this one around so I can grab it with my pliers a little bit better. Break that hose free. Just be gentle with the pliers if you're going to do that. I'm going to put a rag underneath to avoid a lot of spillage getting everywhere. There we go. This hose is not leaking. That's perfect. Since we're here, might as well unbolt this 10mm bolt. On this side, what I can do is just remove this 10mm bolt. This one is different, by the way. It's shorter, so you want to make sure you keep it in the same spot, and then just pull this line with the hose crimped so that it doesn't leak right out of your way. And what I prefer doing is putting these kinds of bolts right back in where they belong so that I don't confuse them for other ones that we'll be taking off soon. Next is this power steering fluid reservoir. There's a 10mm here on a bracket and then one right down below here that you can remove to get the reservoir off with the bracket. These two bolts are the same. Now you can push this out of the way. Let's unplug the map sensor. This line that goes up to the top of the intake has to be turned to be removed, and you can't do that because it's a plastic line and you risk breaking it. If you follow it to the rear valve cover, it's very difficult for me to show you, but if you remember the one that we took off of the intake right here that has the little clip on the side, that's exactly the same style that is secured with. So you're gonna have to reach all the way down here, feel for the clip. If you reach in with your left hand, it'll be on your left thumb that you can grab it with. All the way down there, pop it off. You have to push it backwards basically. And with that off, you'll be able to turn this line a little bit more until you can see this tab ready to pop out. There we go. Get this line out of here. Right where we just were, you'll see a hose clamp with a large vacuum hose attached to it. You have to squeeze that clamp. Once you pull it off far enough, you'll be able to pull the hose off the intake. If you have to use a pry bar, just be very careful not to damage the plastic intake. Sometimes these hoses are very stuck though. There we go. Behind the throttle body, you'll see this hose, or line, I should say, with the white clip. Press on that white clip and twist and pull on the line. You might need a screwdriver or pry bar to press on that clip. There we go. That's what's gonna unlock it. And now you should be able to get this off of here. There we go. And behind it, there's an electrical connector. The electrical connector, if you can get to it now, go ahead and disconnect it. It's right behind it. However, I'm having a hard time actually getting it disconnected and unclipped. So what I'm gonna do is just leave it, wait until we pull the intake up. Once we do, that'll make a lot better access for us to reach and see back there, and I'll just disconnect it at that time. There's a wiring harness going around the intake and it's clipped on in several places. So anywhere that it is attached, take a trim tool and pry it out so that we can move it off of the intake, because the next step is going to be to unbolt it. Over here there's also a push clip that needs to be undone just because it holds on to a plastic shield that is not going to be coming up with the intake. Try to pop this out. A lot of times these get stuck. If it breaks, we'll just replace it. That's not a problem. Try to save it though. Yep, that happens. Push that down if it does break and pop this shield off just like that. Now let's unbolt the 6 13mm bolts that hold this intake on. There's 3 here and 3 here. We're gonna start from the outer ones and work our way towards the middle. You can remove them as you go. The intake is unbolted and unclipped from everywhere except for that electrical connector in the back. Don't forget about that. And we should be able to move it around. There we go, break that free. The intake gasket often gets stuck. Pry this shield out of the way, just like this. Remove this, and don't forget to disconnect that stubborn connector in the back. And there's the intake. Now that we're at this point, you can access all 6 spark plugs. Really, this is the one that was the issue because the intake goes right over it. This is the one in the rear all the way towards the passenger side. And unless you get to this point, you cannot change it. So let's push this white locking clip backwards on the electrical connector so we can unplug the ignition coil. Press down on the center tab and push it back. Sometimes it needs a little bit of persuasion, so very gently push it once it's unlocked. There we go. There's a 10mm bolt here to remove the ignition coil. Take that out, set it aside. The ignition coil should pop right up and out. There it is. Take a 5/8 spark plug socket, slide it down in the spark plug tube. Make sure it's bottomed out and seated on the spark plug. If you don't have a 5/8 spark plug socket, you can use a 16mm as well. Break it free. And remove it the rest of the way. Once you've unthreaded it all the way, you should be able to pull it right up and out. My spark plug socket is a little bit too weak, so I'm just going to use a magnet to fish the spark plug out. And there it is. Now grab your new spark plug, and it's important to have a spark plug socket because when you insert it into a spark plug socket, it'll actually hold it, prevent it from falling down, and then when you put it into the spark plug hole, it's not going to drop down on the tip and get damaged. Also, don't gap these. You can visually check the gap, but gapping these types of spark plugs can actually cause damage to them, and it'll destroy the coating on the electrodes, basically. Having said that, drop this down into the cylinder. Nice and gentle, and thread it on by hand. I'm going to bottom this out. And now let's torque it. 13 foot-pounds is the torque for these spark plugs. That's it right there. Remove your tool. When you put the ignition coil back in, I recommend a very light amount of silicone paste or dielectric grease on the sides of the bottom of the boot here. This will prevent the ignition coil from getting stuck on the spark plug in the future, especially this lower boot here. And I'm gonna put just a tiny bit on the top here. This will help it seal up a little bit better and slide down a little bit better. Take the ignition coil and slide it in. Make sure it gets bottomed out all the way, and might as well plug it in just to get this connector out of the way. Make sure you lock it. Drop the bolt in, snug it up. The torque on these ignition coil mounting bolts is 89 inch-pounds. If you don't have anything that'll torque it that low, about 1/8 of a turn after it bottoms out is plenty. Now repeat the procedure to all the other spark plugs. Now you can remove this rag, and I strongly recommend replacing these gaskets, which I will. You can reuse them if they're in good condition, but you're in here, you might as well put new ones on. Pull these up. A lot of times they get stuck. There we go. If you have a lot of debris here, of course vacuum it. Try not to blow it unless you plug up all these holes so that debris doesn't go in there. And there really isn't much to scrape for me, so all I'm gonna do is take a clean rag and wipe off all of the oil that's on here. Now if you had corrosion going on, you'd want to take a razor blade and scrape it off, but for me the surface is perfectly clean actually. It's just a little bit oily, which is normal, but I need to clean that off. And then we can put the new gasket on. With everything cleaned up, I'm going to install a new gasket. Like I mentioned, it can only go one way. It literally won't fit another way, so just slide it down into place, make sure it's seated. If you look on the bottom of the intake, you want to make sure that this lower intake adapter piece is nice and clean. I wiped it off with a rag. There really was nothing else on here for me to clean, just a little bit of oil, so just wipe it down, flip it over, and get the intake seated. Make sure no wires are getting pinched, or brackets, or hoses, or really anything. Drop all your bolts in. They're all the same. I'm just going to start them and bring them close to being bottomed out. When snugging these and torquing them, it's important that you follow the right sequence so you avoid damage and you can seat this intake properly. You can see the sequence right here on the screen, basically starting from the center bolts, working your way in a cross pattern towards the outer ones. The torque is 18 foot-pounds, however, first I'm just going to snug them by hand with a ratchet. They're snugged, follow the same sequence to torque them. 18 foot-pounds. I'm just going to double check them to make sure they're all good. On the back of the intake where we had the line that plugged into that little solenoid as well as the connector, you're going to want to plug both of those in, starting with the electrical connector. Make sure that clicks. Bring the line down and plug that in, make sure that also clicks. There we go. Let's reinstall this line that goes on the back. You're going to want to start it in on the intake first because this is the side that it needs to bend on. Slide it in, and you're going to want to make sure it pushes all the way down. It's got these two little tabs that need to lock in. This one is going to be a little bit challenging. There we go. That's locked in now. And on the other side, line it up with the valve cover. Press it on, make sure it clicks. On the back side, we also had this vacuum hose. Slide that all the way on. Grab the clamp and clamp it down. Make sure that clamp is lined up to where it was before. That'll give it the best chance of sealing up. Plug in the connector for the map sensor. Make sure that clicks. Plug in the throttle body connector as well. Click that and lock it in place. Around the perimeter of the air intake, I'm going to clip on this harness back with its retainers that were holding it on. There we go. Bring the power steering fluid reservoir over and line up the two bolts. They were both the same on this one. Just start them. This one's going to be a little more difficult to start because it's all the way down there. If you have a magnet, that might help you out. Snug them both up. Bring this coolant line over and the hose on the other side. I'm going to bolt this on first. Had the shorter bolt on the front of the engine and the longer bolt going through the spacer on the line on the back of the engine. Tighten both up. With any of these small bolts here, about 1/8 of a turn after they bottom out is plenty tight. I'm going to take off this cap that I have on the line and slide the hose on, bottom it out all the way. Try to position it as close to where it was before, that way it can seal up the best. And remove the hose crimpers. Reattach the intake snorkel. Slide it on the throttle body first, make sure that's fully bottomed out, and then bring it over to the air filter housing and get that connected as well. And it's supposed to be turned so that this fitting faces flat or parallel to the ground so it can connect to this line. Slide that on, make sure it clicks, and tighten up the 2 clamps. When you tighten these, just make them snug. Even if they can keep turning and tightening, that doesn't mean you have to keep going, because they will strip out and you'll over tighten this, so just make it snug. Remove the oil filler cap carefully and put the engine cover back on. And you want to make sure it lines up with all of the rubber grommets that it slides in with. There we go. Put the oil filler cap back on, and let's put the T30 Torx bolt back in. Just snug, that's all you need to do. And there you have it, job is done.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.